microphone setup wasn't working very well, so I'm switching over just to earbud with microphone built in. I hope that works okay. Again, getting you up to date, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, one of my favorites. And where we left off, our main event so far was the man Jack sneaking into a house on a hill to complete some sort of task that involved getting rid of the entire family except for one that got away. The fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard, enough for that. Look, you could see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors padlocked, ivy on the sides of the spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or a vole or a weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen these things in the moonlight if you had been there that night. You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates, and if you had seen her, with a second, more careful glance, you would have realized that she was only moonlight, mist, and shadow. The plump, pale woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through a clutch of half-fallen tombstones towards the front gates. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 p.m. in winter, at 8 at night in the summer. Spike-topped iron railings ran around part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest of it. The bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old child. "Owens?" called the pale woman in a voice that might have been the rustle of the wind through the long grass. "Owens? Come take a look at this." She crouched down and peered at something on the ground as a patch of shadow moved into the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife and then looked at what she was looking at, and he scratched his head. "Mistress Owens," he said, for he came from a more formal age than our own, "is that what I think it is?" And at that moment the thing he was inspecting seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth, letting the rubber nipple it was sucking fall to the ground, and it reached out a small, chubby fist, as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Mrs. Owens' pale finger. "Strike me silly," said Mr. Owens, "if that isn't a baby." "Of course it's a baby," said his wife, "and the question is, what is to be done with it?" "I dare say that is a question, Mistress Owens," said her husband, "and yet it is not our question. For this here baby is unquestionably alive, and as such is nothing to do with us, and no part of our world." Look at him smile," said Mrs. Owens. "He has the sweetest of smiles." And with one insubstantial hand she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place, for the graveyard covered the whole of the top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling. Someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the old gates and the heavy padlock and chain that held them. "There now," said Owens, "it's the babe's family come to bring him back to the loving bosom. Leave the little man be," he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arms around the toddler, smoothing, stroking. Mrs. Owens said, "He don't look like nobody's family, that one." The man in the dark coat had given up on rattling the main gates and was now examining the smaller side gate. It, too, was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. "Come on, Mistress Owens, leave it be. There's a dear," said Mr. Owens, when he saw a ghost, and his mouth dropped open, and he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did, you would be right, that Mr. Owens should not have taken on so at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead, and had been for a few 100 years now, and given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also dead. But there was a difference between the folk of the graveyard and this. a raw, flickering, startling shape, the gray color of television static, all panic and naked emotion which flooded the Owenses as if it were their own. 3 figures, 2 large, 1 smaller, but only one of them was in focus, was more than an outline or a shimmer, and the figure said, "My baby! He's trying to harm my baby!" A clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy metal garbage can across the alley to the high brick wall that ran round that part of the graveyard. "Protect my son," said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman. Of course, the babe's mother. "What did he do to you?" asked Mrs. Owens, but she was not certain that the ghost could hear her. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake up in due time in the place you were buried, to come to terms with your death, and to get acquainted with the other inhabitants. This creature was nothing but alarm and fear for her child, and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting attention, for other pale figures were coming from all over the graveyard. "Who are you?" Caius Pompeius asked the figure. His headstone was now only a weathered lump of rock, but 2,000 years earlier he had asked to be laid to rest on the mound beside the marble shrine, rather than to have his body sent back to Rome, and he was one of the most senior citizens of the graveyard. He took his responsibilities extremely seriously. "Are you buried here?" "Of course she's not. Freshly dead by the look of her." Mrs. Owens put an arm around the woman's shape and spoke to it privately, in a low voice, calm and sensible. Just a quick interruption. You might be wondering, how could there be a gravestone for somebody named Caius Pompeius 2,000 years ago, when those first Europeans didn't arrive in North America until almost 1,000 years later? And the answer to that is this story actually takes place in England. And so you have European inhabitants that have been here for a very long time. And Caius Pompeius, to me, sounds like a very Roman name. So I wonder if this is a Roman soldier or dignitary that was laid to rest in this English graveyard 2,000 years ago. There was a thump and a crash from the high wall beside the alley. The garbage can had fallen. A man clambered up onto the top of the wall, a dark outline against the mist-smudged streetlights. He paused for a moment, then climbed down the other side, holding on to the top of the wall, legs dangling, and then let himself fall the last few feet down into the graveyard. "But, my dear," Mrs. Owens said to the shape, now all that was left of the 3 shapes that had appeared in the graveyard, "he's living. We're not. Can you imagine?" The child was looking up at them, puzzled. It reached for one of them, then the other, finding nothing but air. The woman's shape was fading fast. "Yes," said Mrs. Owens, in response to something that no one else had heard. "If we can, then we will." Then she turned to the man beside her. "And you, Owens, will you be a father to this little lad?" "Will I what?" said Owens, his brow crinkling. "We never had a child," said his wife, "and his mother wants us to protect him. Will you say yes?" The man in the black coat had tripped in the tangle of ivy and half-broken headstones. Now he got to his feet and walked forward more carefully, startling an owl which rose on silent wings. He could see the baby, and there was triumph in his eyes. Owens knew what his wife was thinking when she used that tone of voice. They had not, in life and in death, been married for over 250 years for nothing. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Sure as I ever been of anything," said Mrs. Owens. "Then, yes, if you'll be its mother, I'll be its father." "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Owens asked the flickering shape in the graveyard, now little more than an outline, like distant summer lightning in the shape of a woman. It said something to her that no one else could hear, and then it was gone. "She'll not come here again," said Mr. Owens. "Next time she wakes, it'll be in her own graveyard, or wherever it is she's going." Mrs. Owens bent down to the baby and extended her arms. "Come now," she said warmly. "Come to Mama." To the man Jack, walking through the graveyard towards them on a path, his knife already in his hand, it seemed as if a swirl of mist had curled around the child. In the moonlight, and that the boy was no longer there, just damp mist and moonlight and swaying grass. He blinked and sniffed the air. Something had happened, but he had no idea what it was. He growled in the back of his throat like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. So I'm thinking about genre right now, and at first I wasn't sure, but I think I have enough evidence to start to put my finger on what genre this book might be. What do you think? I'm starting to think fantasy, because already we've dealt with some stuff that doesn't belong in the world that we know. Ghosts and spirits, and it sounds like even the man Jack, who was the one carrying the knife, might even have some kind of supernatural powers himself, and that to me fits the bill for fantasy. I don't know if you noticed this cover, it's kind of interesting. See what you see. Do you see what I see? At first I just saw the tombstone shape with like a broken part off, and then I realized that the broken part is actually, maybe this helps. And you see kind of the outline of a face of a child. Well, I'm going to stop there. I can't wait to read more later.